Sarah O'Bannon. In the 19th century, coffins used to be built with holes in them, attached to 6 feet of copper tubing and a bell. The tubing would allow for air to reach victims of premature burial, and the bell would be rung by them to signal for help. In a small Texas town, the local gravedigger, upon hearing a bell one night, went to investigate. Sometimes it was the wind. Sometimes it was children pretending to be spirits. This time, it was neither. A voice from below begged and pleaded to be unburied.
"Are you Sarah O'Bannon?"
the gravedigger asked.
Yes!
The muffled voice asserted.
"You were born on September 17th, 1827?
Yes!
Gravestone here says you died on February 20th, 1857.
No, I'm alive! It was a mistake! Please set me free!
The muffled voice asserted.
"Sorry about this, ma'am,"
the gravedigger said, crushing the bell with his boot to silence it and plugging up the copper tube with dirt.
"But this is August. Whatever you are down there, you sure as hell ain't alive no more. You ain't coming up."
Portraits. On a frigid evening, there was a hunter who, after a very long and unfruitful day of chasing game, was in the middle of an immense forest. Having lost his bearings, he decided to head in one direction until he was clear of this increasingly dense forest. After what seemed like hours, the hunter came across a derelict cabin in a small clearing. Realizing how dark it had grown, he decided to see if he could stay there for the night. He approached and found the door ajar. No one was inside. Exhausted, the hunter flopped down on the single bed in the corner of the room, deciding to explain himself to the owner in the morning. As he looked around the inside of the cabin, he was surprised to see the wall on the far end of the cabin adorned with several portraits, all painted in incredible detail. As his eyes scanned the portraits, he found that the faces were all staring back at him with increasingly piercing gazes, with the features of each face contorted to show more anger and malice than the last. Staring back, the hunter grew increasingly uncomfortable before averting his gaze. Making an effort to ignore the many hateful faces, he rolled onto his side to face away, and in his exhaustion, fell into a restless sleep. The next morning, the hunter awoke. He turned, his eyes blinking in unexpected sunlight. Looking up, he discovered that the far wall of the cabin had no portraits, only windows.
Carol. Around this time last year, when I was in the 11th grade, there was this girl I knew who made a dummy for her art project. I don't know what the assignment was, but she made this life-size doll by wrapping herself up in tons of plastic wrap, cutting herself out of it, then taping the shape back up, if you can imagine that. She called this thing Carol, and she put some dirty jeans and a sweater on it, gave it a Halloween wig, and drew a crude face on it too. It looked pretty spooky. At least what we thought was spooky anyway. Despite my friend talking about Carol all the time, I never actually saw Carol until an art teacher made her take it home because it was making him feel uncomfortable. This, of course, was a huge point of pride for my friend, who was proud of her creepy creation. She lived on the same street as me, so we would often walk home together. Since she had to take Carol home, I got my introduction to Carol when we took turns carrying her over our shoulders. Carol was life-size, but she didn't really weigh anything. The clothing on her was the heaviest part. The way Carol looked down didn't spook me much, but carrying her made me feel weird. The way the wind caught her and made her arms and legs move, that creeped me out. On the way home, we stopped at a playground and propped Carol up against a pole, laughing about some kid being creeped out if they saw her. We walked over to the other side of the park to the swing, sitting and talking about school, though mostly just giving Carol a bit of space to see if some unsuspecting kid would walk up to her. The weather was gloomy, so the park stayed empty aside for us. After about 20 minutes, it began to really pour rain, so we gave up on the whole plan. We grabbed our bags and walked over to where we left Carol, but she wasn't there anymore. We looked for Carol, though it was kind of pointless. We were both getting soaked and we still had another 10 minutes to walk home, so we gave up. It doesn't make any sense, but I'm pretty sure nobody could have taken Carol. We were watching the sidewalk the whole time. We joked that she sort of walked off. It was a funny thought, trying to imagine Carol walking with her bent and disjointed legs.
Stairs. In 1984, an old widow lived alone in a 2-story house. Ever since the death of her husband, she required the aid of a caretaker who would visit her daily to assist with everyday tasks, as she was completely bound to her wheelchair. When the old lady needed to move between the 2 floors, the caretaker would have to carry her frail body like an infant, up and down the stairs. One day, the police received a call from the widow. There had been a murder. Since police units were scarce, and the murderer had already fled the scene, only one detective was sent to conduct the initial investigation. The detective arrived to see the caretaker's body splayed out on the ground floor in a pool of his own blood. The old lady sat silent and still atop the staircase in her wheelchair. He could immediately rule her out as a suspect due to her inability to move up and down the stairs. And because she was trapped upstairs at the time of the murder, it was similar to the death of her husband many years ago, who had suffocated in his sleep on the couch downstairs. The detective put on gloves, took photos, swabbed for evidence, and covered the body for the coroner who would arrive later. He explored the ground floor for any clues and then asked the old lady if he could look upstairs. She insisted that she was upstairs the whole time and no one apart from her had been up there all day. But regardless of this, the detective ascended the staircase, to which she hesitantly moved aside. Beyond the staircase, there was a narrow hallway with 3 closed doors along it. He checked behind the first 2 doors, finding an empty bedroom and bathroom before he entered the final bedroom where the old lady slept. Inside, he found nothing more than a bed, a wardrobe, and a bedside table with a lamp. The detective became uneasy. It was not what he discovered, but what he didn't discover that made him stop dead in his tracks and unholster his firearm. It was a detail so minor that it was completely overlooked in the investigation of her husband's death. There was no phone upstairs. The detective heard a crash in the hallway and rushed out of the room, gun in hand, only to find an empty wheelchair atop the stairs.